The autumn sun cast long shadows across the weathered gravestones of St. Michael's Cemetery as mourners gathered for João Santos's funeral. The small village of Pine Grove had never felt quite so still, the air heavy with unspoken grief and the weight of secrets yet to surface. Among the crowd of black-clad figures, a German shepherd named Duke sat motionless beside the polished oak casket, his amber eyes fixed upon its surface with an intensity that made several mourners shift uncomfortably in their seats. The dog's unwavering vigilance had begun the moment the casket arrived at the church. Despite gentle coaxing from Maria, João's sister, and several other villagers, Duke remained steadfast, his powerful frame a silent sentinel guarding his master's final rest. The bond between João and Duke had been legendary in Pine Grove, the kind of connection that made even the most hardened hearts soften at the sight of them walking together through the village square each morning. Father Thomas Matthews stood at the pulpit, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm on the worn wood as he delivered the eulogy. "João Santos was a pillar of our community," he intoned, his voice carrying across the gathered mourners. "A man of integrity, whose generosity touched countless lives." The priest's words seemed to catch in his throat, and he tugged at his collar, beads of sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool October air. Among the mourners sat Daniel Foster, a stranger to Pine Grove who had arrived just days before for a photography assignment documenting small-town life in New England. His keen eye, honed by years behind the camera, noticed details others might miss. The way Father Matthews avoided looking directly at the casket, the subtle tremor in his hands as he turned the pages of his prayer book, the strange tension in his shoulders whenever Duke's gaze briefly turned toward him. The service proceeded with the usual solemnity until Duke's first bark shattered the reverent silence. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the church, causing several mourners to jump in their seats. It wasn't the mournful howl of a dog grieving its master. It was sharp, urgent, almost accusatory. Duke's ears were pricked forward, his body rigid with alertness. "Please," Father Matthews said, his voice strained, "someone remove the dog. This is a house of God, not a kennel." But when two ushers approached, Duke's barking intensified. His deep vocals filled the church with a desperate symphony that seemed to carry a message beyond mere animal distress. Daniel found himself leaning forward, studying the dog's behavior through a photographer's analytical eye. There was something deliberate in the way Duke positioned himself between the casket and Father Matthews, something almost protective. Maria Santos dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her face a mask of distress. "He's never acted like this before," she whispered to no one in particular. Duke was always so quiet in church with João. The disruption continued until Father Matthews announced a brief recess to restore proper order to the service. As the mourners filed out into the cemetery for air, Daniel noticed the priest hurrying toward his office, his vestments billowing behind him like dark wings. Duke's barks followed him, becoming more frantic until the office door slammed shut. Daniel found himself drawn to the dog, who had finally fallen silent but maintained his vigil by the casket. As he approached, Duke's ears twitched in his direction, but the animal showed no aggression. Instead, those intelligent eyes seemed to hold a desperate plea. "What do you see, boy?" Daniel murmured, kneeling beside the German shepherd. "What's got you so worked up?" Duke's response was a low whine, his nose pointing toward the casket before swinging back to the direction of Father Matthews's office. The dog's behavior triggered something in Daniel's journalist instincts, the same gut feeling that had led him to break several major stories in his career. As mourners began filtering back into the church, Daniel overheard fragments of conversations that painted a picture of João Santos, a beloved local carpenter, known for his craftsmanship and integrity, who had recently been spending a lot of time at the church helping with renovations. His death had been unexpected, a heart attack, according to the official report, discovered by Father Matthews himself during early morning prayers. "It doesn't make sense," an elderly woman whispered to her companion. João was healthy as a horse, never missed a day of work in his life. "And he was so excited about the church restoration project," another added. "Said he discovered something interesting in the old woodwork." Daniel's attention was drawn to Maria Santos, who stood apart from the other mourners, her hands clasped tightly together. There was something in her expression beyond grief. Fear, perhaps, or uncertainty. When their eyes met briefly, she quickly looked away, but not before Daniel caught a glimpse of what looked like a silent cry for help. Father Matthews returned, his composure restored, but his face still pale. As he approached the pulpit to resume the service, Duke's growl rumbled low and threatening. The priest froze mid-step, and for a moment, Daniel saw naked panic flash across his face before it was quickly masked by clerical dignity. The photographer's hand itched for his camera, but he held back. This wasn't a story to be captured in images, at least not yet. Something was unfolding here in this small village church. Something dark and hidden beneath the surface of religious ceremony and communal grief. As the service continued, Daniel made a decision. He would stay in Pine Grove a while longer. His instincts told him there was more to João Santos's death than a simple heart attack, and Duke's behavior was the key to unraveling whatever secret lay buried beneath the pious veneer of St. Michael's Church. The sun continued its arc across the sky, casting shifting shadows through the stained glass windows. Duke maintained his vigilant watch, his posture unchanged, while Daniel observed and waited. In Pine Grove, where everyone knew everyone else's business, secrets had a way of rising to the surface, like bodies in a flood. And as Father Matthews concluded the service with trembling hands and a voice that cracked on the final, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this funeral was not an ending, but rather the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous than anyone in the quiet village could imagine. As the final notes of the hymn faded into the rafters, an unsettling quietude descended upon St. Michael's Church. The mourners remained seated, as if held in place by an invisible force, their usual eagerness to depart after a service notably absent. Duke's earlier outbursts had created a current of unease that rippled through the congregation, transforming what should have been a somber farewell into something far more disquieting. Daniel watched as Father Matthews descended from the pulpit, his movements mechanical and stilted. The priest's earlier composure had begun to crack again, like old paint peeling away to reveal darker colors beneath. His hands, when he reached to close his Bible, trembled so violently that the sound of rustling pages carried to the back pews. From his position near the rear of the church, Daniel noticed Maria Santos slip something in her handbag, a flash of white that disappeared too quickly to identify. Her eyes darted around the church interior, lingering for a moment on the elaborate wooden panels that João had been restoring before his death. There was something deliberate in her gaze, a searching quality that spoke of unfinished business. Duke's behavior shifted subtly as the afternoon light began to fade through the stained glass windows. His vigilant posture remained unchanged, but his ears twitched at every movement Father Matthews made, tracking the priest's progress across the sanctuary as if following the path of a predator. The dog's muscles rippled beneath his fur, tension visible in every line of his powerful frame. Several of the older villagers had gathered in small clusters, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz of speculation that filled the church's vaulted ceiling. Daniel edged closer to one such group, his journalist's instincts drawing him toward the subtle signs of discord in what should have been a unified expression of grief. João was in here every day for weeks, an elderly woman murmured, her gnarled hands worried at a handkerchief. Said he'd found something in the old confessional that needed attention. Something about the woodwork being different from the original plans. And did you notice how the father barely mentioned João's work on the renovation? Another added, her voice barely above a whisper. After all those hours they spent together, you'd think there'd be more to say. A third woman made the sign of the cross, her weathered face creased with concern. The day before it happened, I saw João and the father arguing in the garden. Never seen João raise his voice before, not in all my years knowing him. He was waving some kind of paper. Their conversation cut off abruptly as Father Matthews approached, his shadow falling across their huddled forms. The priest's smile seemed stretched too thin across his face, like a mask that didn't quite fit. Ladies, thank you for coming today. João would have been touched by your presence. The women murmured appropriate responses, But Daniel noticed how they drew slightly away from the priest, their bodies angling toward each other in an unconscious gesture of protection. There was fear there, subtle but unmistakable, and it spoke volumes about the undercurrents flowing beneath the surface of this tight-knit community. As the sun continued its descent, shadows lengthened across the church floor like reaching fingers. The stained glass windows, which had earlier filled the space with jeweled light, now cast darker, more ominous patterns across the assembled mourners. The image of Saint Michael, sword raised against evil, seemed to flicker with movement in the changing light, as if the eternal battle depicted in glass was somehow becoming more immediate and real. Duke's head suddenly snapped toward the confessional, a low growl building in his chest. The sound carried an edge of warning that made several nearby mourners step back instinctively. Father Matthews, who had been making his way toward the confessional, froze mid-stride, his face draining of color so rapidly that for a moment Daniel thought he might faint. Maria Santos rose from her pew, her movements deliberate and careful, like someone trying not to startle a dangerous animal. But it wasn't Duke she seemed wary of. Her eyes were fixed on Father Matthews, watching his reaction to the dog's warning with an intensity that spoke of more than casual interest. The priest recovered quickly, smoothing his vestments with trembling hands. "Perhaps we should move to the cemetery for the committal service," he announced, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that rang false in the hushed atmosphere. "The light is fading, and we wouldn't want to delay." But Duke had other ideas. As two altar boys moved to open the heavy church doors, the German shepherd planted himself more firmly beside Joao's casket, his stance making it clear that no one would be moving his master's body without his approval. The dog's behavior had shifted from protective to possessive, as if he understood that once Joao was buried, something crucial would be lost forever. Daniel found himself moving closer to the casket, drawn by the same instinct that had served him well in countless investigations. There was something about the angle of Duke's head, the way he alternated between atching the confessional and tracking Father Matthews's movements, that suggested a pattern. The dog wasn't just grieving, he was trying to tell them something. The photographer's mind raced through the fragments of conversation he'd overheard, piecing together a puzzle whose picture was still frustratingly unclear. Joao's work on the church renovation, the argument in the garden, the mysterious paper, the confessional that somehow didn't match the original plans. Each piece seemed significant, but the connections remained elusive. As if reading his thoughts, Duke turned his head slightly toward Daniel, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent communication. In that brief exchange, Daniel felt the weight of understanding pass between them. Whatever secret lay buried in St. Michael's Church, Duke knew its nature, and he had chosen Daniel as his ally in bringing it to light. The remaining daylight was rapidly fading now, the church interior growing darker with each passing minute. The shadows seemed to hold secrets of their own, and the whispered conversations of the mourners took on an urgent quality, as if everyone sensed that time was running out for something crucial to be revealed. In the gathering darkness, Father Matthews's voice cracked as he tried once again to move the service forward. "Please, we must proceed to the cemetery. It's not proper to delay the burial." But his words trailed off as Duke's growl deepened, the sound resonating through the church like distant thunder. And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight painted the church in shades of blood and gold, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that leaving now would mean losing something vital, some critical piece of evidence that Duke was trying desperately to protect. The truth about Joao Santos's death lay somewhere within these hallowed walls, and it would take more than priestly authority to keep it buried. The commitment to stay and uncover the truth settled over Daniel like a mantle, heavy with responsibility, but impossible to ignore. As he watched Father Matthews retreat once again toward his office, the priest's shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden, Daniel began to formulate a plan. Whatever Joao had discovered during his work on the church renovation, whatever had led to his untimely death, it was clear that Duke would not rest until justice was served. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the church interior lit only by flickering candles and the dim fluorescent lights that cast more shadows than illumination. In this half-light, the boundaries between truth and deception seemed to blur, but Duke's unwavering vigilance remained a constant reminder that some things were worth guarding, even beyond death. As the mourners finally began to disperse, their reluctant footsteps echoing off the ancient stones, Daniel settled into a pew near the casket. He pulled out his notebook, more for comfort than any real intention to write, and prepared for what promised to be a long night. Whatever secrets St. Michael's Church held, they would have to wait until darkness provided cover for a more thorough investigation. And with Duke as his unlikely partner, Daniel had a feeling those secrets wouldn't remain hidden for much longer. The empty church creaked and settled around Daniel as night fully descended, each sound amplified by the vast, hollow space. Duke remained his steadfast companion, the dog's presence both reassuring and unsettling in the growing darkness. The German shepherd's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the votive candles, reflecting a determination that matched Daniel's own. Through the stained glass windows, moonlight began to filter in, creating abstract patterns on the stone floor that seemed to shift and change like living things. The saints and angels depicted in the ancient glass took on an otherworldly quality, their frozen expressions somehow more knowing in the darkness. St. Michael's sword, caught in a shaft of moonlight, cast a silver line across Joao's casket like a silent accusation. Daniel's pen hovered over the blank page of his notebook, his mind racing through the events of the day. He had originally come to Pine Grove for a simple human interest story about small-town life, but fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, had drawn him into what increasingly felt like a conspiracy. The teenager working at the local diner had mentioned that Joao was a regular there, always sitting in the same booth by the window, often engaged in intense conversations with Maria over coffee and pie. A sudden scratching sound from the direction of the confessional made both Daniel and Duke snap to attention. The dog's ears pricked forward, but he didn't bark. Instead, he let out a low whine that seemed to carry a note of recognition. Daniel held his breath, straining to hear more, but the sound didn't repeat. Still, Duke's reaction confirmed his growing suspicion that the confessional held some significance in whatever drama had played out between Joao and Father Matthews. Moving as quietly as possible, Daniel pulled out his phone and began reviewing the photos he'd taken during the service. He hadn't been officially photographing the funeral, but his journalist habits had led him to discreetly document certain moments. Father Matthews's nervous gestures, Maria's furtive movements, the strange way the altar boys had avoided looking at the casket when they passed it. In one image, captured almost by accident, he noticed something he'd missed in real time. A small key hanging from a chain around Maria's neck, visible only for a moment when she'd leaned forward to adjust her shawl. The sound of footsteps in the vestibule caused Daniel to quickly pocket his phone. Duke's head turned toward the sound, but the dog remained surprisingly calm. Moments later, Maria Santos emerged from the shadows, her dark clothes making her almost invisible in the dimness. She showed no surprise at finding Daniel there, as if she had expected, or perhaps hoped, to find someone keeping vigil. "You noticed something too, didn't you?" she whispered, sliding into the pew beside him. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she clutched her handbag. "During the service, about Father Matthews." Daniel chose his words carefully, aware that in small towns like Pine Grove, trust was a currency not easily earned. Duke's behavior seemed to upset him more than it should have. Maria nodded, her eyes fixed on the confessional. "Joao discovered something 3 weeks ago, during the renovation work. He wouldn't tell me exactly what it was, said it was better if I didn't know the details. But he was different after that, nervous, always looking over his shoulder." She paused, swallowing hard. "The night before they found him, he called me, said he had proof of something that would shake this town to its foundations." A door slammed somewhere in the church's adjacent buildings, causing both of them to start. Duke remained calm, suggesting that whatever had caused the noise wasn't a threat, at least not yet. The candles flickered in a sudden draft, sending shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. "Joao left something for me," Maria continued, her voice dropping even lower. A letter hidden in a place only I would know to look. But I can't get to it. Not with. She glanced toward the church office, where a light still burned behind the frosted glass. Not with him watching my every move. Daniel felt the weight of her unspoken request. The letter, it's in the church somewhere? Maria's response was cut off by the sound of approaching footsteps, heavier this time, and accompanied by the jingle of keys. Duke's demeanor changed instantly, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Maria quickly stood, her face a mask of fear. "Tomorrow," she whispered urgently. "Meet me at the Diner A. T Sunrise. There's something you need to see." Without waiting for a response, she melted back into the shadows, leaving Daniel alone with Duke just as Father Matthews's voice echoed through the church. "Mr. Foster, I must insist that you leave now. The church needs to be locked for the night." The priest's tone was pleasant enough, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there during the service. As Daniel gathered his things, appearing to comply with the request, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, a faint gleam caught his eye, something metallic protruding ever so slightly from beneath the confessional door. Duke's gaze followed his, and the dog's tail moved in a single deliberate wag, as if confirming the significance of what Daniel had seen. "Of course, Father," Daniel replied, keeping his voice casual. "I was just paying my respects." Duke seems reluctant to leave his master. Father Matthews remained in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the light from his office. "The dog will have to be removed before morning. We can't have animals in the church during the burial service." The priest's words carried a finality that seemed to encompass more than just Duke's presence, but Daniel detected a note of uncertainty beneath the authoritative tone. Whatever secret Joao had discovered, whatever evidence might be hidden in that confessional, Father Matthews wasn't entirely confident in its security. As Daniel made his way toward the exit, Duke finally moved from his position by the casket, but not to follow him. Instead, the dog circled once deliberately before lying down directly in front of the confessional, his body positioned between it and Father Matthews. The message was clear. Nothing would be disturbed in this church tonight. The priest's frustrated sigh told Daniel that Duke had just unknowingly bought them valuable time. Whatever Maria wanted to show him at sunrise, whatever clue lay hidden beneath the confessional door, it would have to wait for morning. But as Daniel stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of Joao's unsolved death pressing heavily on his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The moon hung low over Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the cemetery where Joao's grave lay waiting. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, Duke stood guard over secrets that refused to stay buried. And somewhere in the darkness, the truth about Joao Santos's death waited to be discovered.